My guest today is John Collins. John Collins is the author and webmaster of William Branham Historical Research. He was born and raised in the message cult following of William Branham and is the grandson of Willard Collins, former pastor of William Branham's Branham Tabernacle in Jeffersonville, Indiana, from 1976 to 2012. John was unduly influenced to believe and practice many of the religious and cultural views expressed by William Branham and by men and women who were in Branham's inner circle. In addition to his work at william-branham.org, he also maintains the YouTube channel Leaving the Message, which I highly recommend. John Collins, welcome to the Bruce Collins Show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on. Now, before we talk about UFOs in the context of their odd interest by past and present charismatics, can you give us a brief summary of what people can find at william-branham.org, as well as your YouTube channel, Leaving the Message?
I guess the best way to describe it would be infinite rabbit trails. I began studying William Branham and his history, not knowing all of the spiderweb of deceit and connections to it. And long story short, I began interviewing other people and finding information through either research or going through archives to document some of the different ministries that evolved from Branhamism and some of those that evolved before that led to Branhamism. So I guess you could say it's a big spiderweb of Pentecostal/charismatic history.
Mm-hmm. So looking at the charismatic and Pentecostal movements, again, why do you think William Branham is so important to understand? Is he sort of like a hub?
He is considered to be the foremost leader of the post-World War II healing revival. He was one of two main catalysts for the Latter Rain movement and the charismatic movement that developed after that, and today's New Apostolic Reformation, all developed because of that movement that he was spearheading.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of your initial work has been in the history of the charismatic leadership over the years. And in the middle of the 20th century, as we're stating, we had the healing revivals with names like William Branham, O.L. Jaggers, Jim Jones, and others. Was Bible prophecy a big part of the healing revivals to sort of show an immediacy to their cause?
Actually, I would take it a step further. The Bible prophecy was the framework that led to it. You have to go back to British Israelism and Christian identity and understand that this was a movement, movements that developed into the idea that the people of the British Isles and the people of the Americas were the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And they reinterpreted the Bible to read it as though the Old Testament was written in shadow for biblical prophecy to be fulfilled in today's world. So when they read a biblical prophecy about Nineveh, for example, you find, even Branham did this. He would say, Nineveh, that passage about Nineveh is referring to actually Outer Drive in Chicago. And he starts talking about the chariots going to and fro. And so they basically reinterpreted Bible prophecy. And from that framework, they began to build on top of that, different ideas that were related to the prophecies.
So then how did the interest in UFOs come about in their ministries?
That is an interesting question, and one that has, I'm not a UFO fanatic by no means, but I am a sci-fi fan. In fact, every episode has the Millennium Falcon over here, if you can see it behind me. I'm a big sci-fi fan, and so I find the research fascinating. I don't so much necessarily believe in the UFOs. However, I was indoctrinated from youth to believe that there were signs in the heaven in the form of UFOs and that they were the angels coming down at the end time. And that was a theme that was flowing through the movement. The question becomes a chicken or egg question, which came first, the question about what are the UFOs or the propaganda that went with it. I leaned towards it was an interesting propaganda that spawned off a lot of ministries. I guess the ability to attract the itching ears. And what's really interesting, I just opened it today. There's a third trove of documents that was released from the Pentagon. I'm going through the timelines of the UFO research, and in the back of my mind, I'm also connecting it to the timelines of the CIA. And if you look at the major milestones in this, you're going to find that they almost perfectly align with key moments in the movement. So you have to question, was it being fed from, were the government trying to feed ideas into the movement so that it would be a distraction for the enemy? And one document I'm reading through, it actually does answer that question, in my opinion. In some ways, yes.
Hmm.
But then there's some unknown that you have to deal with too. And what is this weird thing that is spawning off lights out of the pond and splitting into different orbs? So some of it you can explain as it was propaganda for the itching ears and it attracted people to it. Then on the other hand, you've got the just complete nut jobs that believed it. And the third aspect that I'll bring to this is the Christian identity framework introduced a weird theological propaganda, basically, that reinterpreted Bible scripture to say that our vessels on this earth are light beings and we are to be connected to a celestial being out in the skies. And this spread all throughout charismatic, Pentecostal, latter rain type ministries. Branham was one included. He said one day a UFO would sweep down and pick us up to go into the rapture. So you had doctrinal, you had mental health issues, and I think you had government propaganda, all three at the same time.
Hmm. So when I was a child, when I was young, my grandfather was a pastor in the Foursquare Church, and my stepfather, I found a book in his library that you may know of this book. It was called Flying Saucerama, and it was positing that these were angelic beings that were driving these spaceships. It seems to be in the current day, the spaceships are now evil. So was it early on that these were the good angels, as it were?
Well, that's interesting too, because in the document that I read today, talking about, I think it's the U2 document, if you want to go look it up, they were, they called the project for some of the high flying orbs or vessels that they were creating, they actually nicknamed them by the government the angels.
Hmm.
So again, I go back to the question, did the government start it? Did this start
Right.
it? But if you look at the Foursquare Church, there's some interesting history there, some of which appears to coincide with the government documentation, and some of it which seems to, in my opinion, just be people who are nuts, who are spreading themes that, attract the itching ears and attract their own itching mind, I guess you would say. When the latter rain movement was created, the year is 1947, the same year that the UFO weirdness was starting to take off. And as I said, Branham was one of the people spearheading the movement. He and Franklin Hall were the catalyst for the latter rain revivals at the Sharon Orphanage. And the Sharon Orphanage had this weird airport hangar, which was somehow tied to their orphanage and schools. And there's just a lot of unanswered questions as to why all of that was necessary. But whenever you connect all of the dots, what you end up with is this. You have the Foursquare Church funding the Sharon Orphanage. That documentation, only recently we were able to piece that together. Out of the Foursquare Church, you had people who were heavily invested in Christian identity, which taught the celestial beings weirdness. Gordon Lindsay, who was Branham's campaign manager, led the Voice of Healing revivals, later founded Christ for the Nations. He published all kinds of UFO books and UFO articles in the Voice of Healing magazine. So Gordon Lindsay's a big figure in it. He was a leader in Foursquare. You also had Wesley Swift, who is the most notorious Christian identity leader of the 50s and 60s. He's working with Branham's mentor, who was the head of the KKK. So you've got this weird connection of white supremacy, Christian identity, British Israelism, Pentecostalism. And what it did was it attracted a wide variety of people, some of whom were devout, religious people looking to seek God, some of which had different intentions. I'll just say it like that.
Mhm. And again, we're speaking with John Collins. He is the webmaster at william-branham.org and also has a great YouTube channel, Leaving the Message. At william-branham.org, he's also written several books that you may want to check out. Now, John, were little green men being part of a gospel message widely accepted by those in attendance, or was there any pushback?
I always laugh whenever I get that question. Little green men and also giant ants were some of the
Wow.
themes. There are just so many weird. I grew up fascinated by one of the prophecies that birds with a 15 to 30-foot wingspan would be attacking the United States, all of which came out of propaganda magazines, which I have communicated with you via email. What was happening? People were there was a lot of fear for the Cold War, for the they believed in an impending Russian invasion, and the hearts were so in fear. They were looking for answers, but the problem is the government wasn't really giving any answers, and so they were looking to the religious leaders of the era to get the answers, and they also didn't have the answers. So, in my opinion, they just pulled some things out of their butt. But those who weren't creative enough to do this, they would pull it out of some of these, like Fate magazine. They would copy some of that propaganda and then republish it in the Voice of Healing. I've got a couple of examples of this. And so, in the end, what it turns into is there was a lot of fiction that was flowing through the movement, but it was twisted in such a way that the fiction was asking a biblical question. And because of that, because of the twisting, people began to associate this with Bible themes. And you had ministries who didn't understand that it was fiction. They started to build upon those themes. And so propaganda eventually turned into doctrine. Doctrine turned into cults. And that's the weird mess that we have.
Mhm. So many years ago, I was in Southern California with my brother, and my brother knew way more about Word of Faith, William Branham, and all of that. And he turned on the TV, I think, looking for this person, and it was O.L. Jaggers. And O.L. Jaggers had this long, flowing white robe that looked like he had come out of the flying saucer. And I asked him, "Who is this guy?" And he said, "Oh, that's O.L. Jaggers. He went goofy." And I know that many Christians will say, William Branham, he went off track with UFOs. However, weren't Branham and Jaggers and others teaching this during the Healing Revival meetings?
Oh, absolutely. It was published in the magazines. The Voice of Healing, which was created specifically to promote William Branham's ministry and later involved all of the other ministries, they were publishing this kind of weird thing. And there were A. Allen as another guy. He was publishing some UFO documentation. Again, they were trying to give biblical answers, but the way that they gave the biblical answers was to connect it to fictional stories, which is, in my opinion, it's a little bit underhanded. Then there's the gray area. There were legitimately UFO sightings, now they call them UIPs, that they could not answer. Even the government could not answer. So you had, again, this wide variety. Some of it is coming from Fate magazine. Some of it is just republishing documents and articles that were in the newspaper. But when they connected to a biblical theme, that's when it entered into the ministry. And there was one article, I can't remember from what year, but some guy claimed that he saw little green men in the UFO in a non-religious setting. So that got picked up by one of the, I don't know if it was Fate or one of the other magazines. Then it turned into, well, we must give a biblical answer for these little green men, or otherwise everybody's going to leave the revivals. So they started saying that these were either angels or demons or whatever they could come up with.
Hmm. And again, Fate magazine, the publisher, also published amazing stories. So
Exactly.
part and
Exactly.
parcel. Now, fast forward to today, and this is also covered in a YouTube video that you made. Perry Stone announces that there was a secret alien meeting, and the government wanted Christian preachers to get their audience ready for alien beings, specifically mentioning reptilians. How can we connect the dots from Perry Stone to William Branham?
Actually, you'll connect it from Perry Stone to William Branham to Wesley Swift to the Foursquare Church. Again, the
Wow.
Foursquare Church, they are, I don't know if they were teaching Christian identity in Life Bible College or if they were just accepting of the doctrine, because there were people, many of them, not a tremendous number, but most of the um, early Christian identity people that I have come in contact with have some sort of a connection back to Life Bible College. Gordon Lindsay being one of them. Lindsay was speaking as a keynote speaker for the Anglo-Saxon Federation, for example. This was during the point in time in which the Christian identity, British Israel themes were starting to turn racist. And Wesley Swift was the king of the racist Christian identity people. He was also trained from Life Bible College. One of the themes in Christian identity was that the passages from the book of Genesis talking about the creation story were obscured. And when it says that the serpent defiled Eve, what they were teaching was that there was sex between Eve and the serpent. And the serpent's alien bloodline was injected into the human bloodline, and Cain and Abel were two different bloodlines. So the theology behind this, which is absurd and racist, was that the people who developed black skin came from the alien race, and the people with white skin came from the good race. And that, turned into all kinds of propaganda. Branham rebranded this. He took out the word race, and he taught what he called the serpent's seed doctrine, which was basically the two-seed doctrine of Christian identity. And in this doctrine, he was saying the same thing. The serpent mated with Eve, and they created a second bloodline. But then he traced the bloodline in the same path as Wesley Swift, which anybody listening would have known was black skin. If they didn't catch it by that, he followed it up with this doctrine he called hybriding, where black people could not mate with white people. So by then, you have to understand it's racist. This was all part of the serpent propaganda, and the Christian identity people who believed in celestial beings was saying that one of these evil celestial beings came and impregnated Eve, the mother of all living, and that's why we have alien DNA.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've met people who still teach that serpent seed doctrine. It's crazy. Perry Stone heard about this secret alien meeting from charismatic preachers like Joseph Z., Alan DiDio, Larry Ragman. Larry Ragman was one that went on a rant about people aren't ready. The government wants Christian preachers to warn their people of what's coming. And these guys are kind of loosely tied to Rick Renner. They go on his shows. Rick Renner is a preacher who was in Russia who helped Kenneth Copeland get on TV there, and he now appears on Copeland's show. Do these ties surprise you?
Not at all, nor the propaganda being spread. If you follow the history of the movement, they anticipate something that might pose a question. In other words, if a question surfaces in the mind, if people begin to critically think, there's going to be a problem. There will be what they call the great falling away. And what this is essentially, if people develop critical thinking, they're probably going to leave the movement because the movement itself can't withstand critical thought. So what they try to do is spearhead it off at the pass. Let's get all of the questions answered before the questions come out. And it is, to quote Richard Nixon, of all people, he said that we're fighting today a battle of the minds. And in an address to the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship, which came on the heels of the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C., he told Branham and other leaders of this movement that communism is a battle of the minds, and I'm paraphrasing greatly, we need you preachers to help fight that battle in the minds. And so, again, piecing the timeline together, you have Richard Nixon's speech. Right after this was this weird biblical prophecy, and the UFO themes kind of took a dangerous dark turn during the 50s, if you remember it.
Yeah. When I was a kid, growing up in the Foursquare Church, we always watched TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, and I didn't even realize at that point that was not, what was so accepted as Christianity among all Christians. I thought that was just regular programming. And I've often wondered, we can't dismiss that the word of faith and the charismatic view has grown considerably over the 20th century and now the 21st century. Why do you think people were so receptive to it?
Well, it was following on the heels of Branham's death. So in this Christian identity themed movement, it got strange because the movement grew at such a fast pace that people didn't realize that they were actually spreading Christian identity themes. So you had people coming into the revival who weren't actually racist, being taught this racist doctrine, and then trying to make sense of it. And so the bedrock was laid. They believed and were teaching during that time that the last chapter of the book of Malachi was, instead of talking about John the Baptist when it said, "Behold, I will send you Elijah," and ignoring passages from Luke and the other Gospels when Jesus said, "This is the Elijah that was to come," they were saying that that prophecy was written in shadow to the ancient world, and then today Elijah has returned to the earth. And they believed that this was in the form of William Branham. T.L. Osborne, who was big in the charismatic movement. He was both Word of Faith. He was prosperity gospel. He helped spread documents and training materials to the shepherding movement, which was a bedrock that eventually developed into today's New Apostolic Reformation. He believed that Branham was not only this Elijah figure, but was God in the flesh. And he said this at Branham's memorial speech at a Full Gospel Businessmen's meeting, fellowship meeting. So you had this movement that had adopted Branhamism to the extent that they believed that Branham was literally God returned to the earth in the flesh. And then he died. So when he died, what do you do with this? You start to build upon that theme. And so everything becomes more and more integrated. You mentioned TBN. T.L. Osborne's the guy with the handlebar mustaches that
Yep.
you used to see on TBN, right? So
Mhm.
he's working deeply embedded into the charismatic movement. You also have Paul Cain, who was William Branham's protege. He was doing the same thing from the other side, and he was helping spread it through the circles that weren't so prosperity gospel themed. So it was attacked from multiple angles. You can go to Chuck Smith. He was part of the Branhamite movement. Yeah, he was in latter rain. He was a Foursquare minister in Phoenix that hosted William Branham at the church. So there are, I can't tell you how many hundreds of different paths to go down, these rabbit trails to go down, but they all connect back to the same platform that was spreading the UFO theology. So if you build upon that theology, you're going to end up with various trails of it in today's world and today's theology.
Mhm. Yeah, as you said, there's so many rabbit trails, and that's why I hope people check out your YouTube channel, Leaving the Message, because you've done the research and just interesting stuff. If you want to know the gift that T.L. Osborne gave to William Branham, watch John Collins's YouTube channel, Leaving the Message. It's just amazing, and also Paul Cain's other life. We'll leave it at that. I wanted to give you a chance in the closing minutes to talk about your books. If you could recommend one book to start with for the people listening today, which one would it be, and what is it about?
I would recommend the latest one, which is Weaponized Religion from Christian Identity to the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR, mainly because it really is a summary of all of the other research and books that I have. Some of the others were deep dives. For example, I have a deep dive on John Alexander Dowie, who is the prototype for all of the faith healing evangelists that were trying to build their kingdoms. He's important to the movement, but the movement as a whole really developed from Christian identity into today's New Apostolic Reformation. So when you see all of the public outcry of these so-called ministers, some of them I question whether they really have a ministry, who are trying to sway
Yeah.
politics and swaying it in weird directions based off of weird numerologies and different themes that just don't make any sense. People question that. How did that develop? Where did that come from? You can read this book and it'll tell you how all of this came to be.
Mhm. John Collins, the YouTube channel is Leaving the Message, and also William-Branham.org is the website. Lastly, John, how can people support your work?
Well, on the YouTube site, you can become a member if you want to support. There is a research supporter level that you can reach if you want to support there. We also have a Patreon page. So if you go to the website, william-branham.org, you can click onto the support page and you can donate.
Excellent. Well, John Collins, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me.